So at a country level analysis, let's begin with Brazil. In Brazil, the title here is Pinch Your Nose and Enjoy the Animal Spirit. So there's a lot of similarities to Trump in the United States. The traditional left in Brazil can't stand this guy. And a lot of the elites also really dislike the sort of misogynist, often racist comments that he makes, his policies that put at risk wetlands and the Amazon in favor of expansion of the agricultural footprint in Brazil and expansion of mining concessions, etc. But for those who are investing in Brazil, they like what they're hearing, they like what they're seeing. Brazil is very, very close to passing pension reform. It was watered down considerably, but probably is enough there to at least keep investors' monies parked in Brazil. The more challenging reforms will come next in tax reforms, the simplification of Brazil's very complex tax system, federalist tax system. I don't know that they'll be able to achieve that, but the very fact that they're willing to take it on and seem to have significant political capital to do so is really positive. You also have what's very exciting right now are the privatizations and the concessions that are being made to allow private monies to go into airports, to roads, more into ports. We're talking about $600 to $700 billion of investments. Much of it will come from abroad. And this has really got people excited about Brazil again. You also see an increase in mining and energy investment, again, in part because Bolsonaro has dismantled some of the national content rules that were put in place by the PT, and that has got people excited. But there's also risks. Bolsonaro's own rhetoric, his unapologetic stance on the Amazon has really upset some leaders in Europe. And this could lead to further delays of any, and possibly derail any chances of a EU-Mercosur free trade agreement. That would be a shame for Brazil's agro sector in particular. And of course, if Chinese and US trade war continues, that's going to hurt the price of industrial metals, which are an important source of exports for Brazil. But by and large, Brazil is the brightest economic light and is driving a lot of that corporate optimism that we saw in our survey. On the next slide. In Mexico. Mexico really is a tale of two economies. On the one hand, the economic case for exporting from Mexico to the United States has never been stronger. In spite of the rhetoric in Washington, in spite of the Trump campaigns against Mexico, you have strong demand in the US still, consumer demand. You have manufacturing production at full capacity. You have a labor pool in the United States that's shrinking, and the ability to absorb new workers into the manufacturing sector in the US is very constrained. You have a Mexican peso that remains probably 10% weaker than it ought to be because of political risk, possibly even weaker than that. And so the economic case for outsourcing is very strong, and we've seen steady growth of exports ever since Trump came into power, ironically. On the other hand, you have the domestic economy. And the domestic economy in Mexico is driven really by three factors. One is the consumer. And consumption in Mexico continues to be fairly strong. And that's really because Mexicans never got themselves into the kinds of debt levels that Brazilians and Colombians and Chileans did. So they still have access to credit to keep spending. The second is government spending. And to AMLO's credit, he has balanced the budget because he is afraid of the credit agencies pushing him in or raising the cost of capital for Mexico, because he understands that that would raise borrowing costs and further reduce his fiscal opportunities. But the biggest concern is business investment. The large industrial groups in Mexico, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that they are moving money offshore, that they're keeping their investments to a minimal in Mexico. And this is eventually going to have an impact on growth. It's going to have an impact on employment, and it's going to have an impact on demand. In fact, today, Mexico is officially still growing, but if you were to separate out the domestic economy from the export economy, by our calculations, the domestic economy is already in recession. And here are 10 examples of policy decisions by the AMLO administration that have one by one diminished investor confidence in the domestic economy in Mexico. And so if he keeps going like this, we're going to really feel it in Mexico over the next few years. Okay, on to Argentina. This election 4 months ago was seen as a binary election. In other words, either Macri wins and Argentina is saved, or the Peronists win and Argentina goes to hell in a handbasket. At this point, with the by-election win and the further devaluation, the further spending of the IMF line on defending a peso, money that is just thrown away, the inability to get his arms around inflation in Argentina means that whoever wins the election is going to inherit a very difficult situation. And even if Macri wins, there is no guarantee that his neoliberal policies are going to pull Argentina out of this mess. Nonetheless, there's even less investor confidence around a Fernandez victory and the Peronists, 4 years of the Peronists ahead of us. At this point, the per capita income in Argentina is now less than Peru for the first time in the last 250 years. That's how far Argentina has fallen. Is there a bright light? There is, in the sense that Argentina is home to some very interesting deposits in both energy and mining sectors. And whoever wins the election is going to have to be friendly, and generally has been friendly, to both of these sectors. There is some risk that in the energy sector, there might be minimal national employment standards set upon any project expansion there. But generally speaking, those sectors will probably be relatively immune to what's going on in Buenos Aires. Other than that, most other businesses in Latin America are going to suffer. Sorry, in Argentina are going to suffer. Okay, let's move on. In Colombia, there's still a lot of investor confidence around Ivan Duque, who is, by all definitions, a technocrat. Worked at the IDB for years, is a protege of Uribe, and says all the right things. Unfortunately, he has no practice governing, and that lack of experience is really showing. And he has struggled to pass budgets. He has struggled to exercise power in what is a rough and tumble political reality of congressional politics in Colombia. And now with midterm elections that impact municipal and departmental leaders across Colombia, we may see a further weakening of Duque's power. So a lot of projects, a lot of investment projects are looking at those elections with concern in their eyes. And what goes on in those elections may, in fact, have an impact on national politics as well. Nonetheless, there are a couple of real bright lights in Colombia. First of all, the infrastructure projects, which rely on private capital, which were engineered under the Santos administration, are moving forward under Duque. They were partially delayed by the change in power, but they're now moving forward, and those will bring much needed monies to improving infrastructure in Colombia. And you have a reindustrialization of Colombia's manufacturing sector, which really suffered when the Colombian peso was strong. And now that it's been weak since late 2014, when the price of oil collapsed and with the Colombian peso, such that retailers have increasingly moved towards finding suppliers inside Colombia. And that has been a source of growth and opportunity in Colombia. On the next slide, we come to Chile. Now, people are trying to scratch their heads and understand what's going on in Chile, because for those who perhaps haven't lived in Chile or spent a long time there, they've heard nothing but positive news about Chile for the last 20 years. This is the poster child of neoliberal reforms. This is the country that has embraced a form of capitalism of true transparent capitalism that has lifted all people out of poverty, lifted so many people out of poverty in Chile, etc. Their pension systems have been adopted around the world. So why is Chile up in arms? Well, one of the things that Chile has suffered with is, yes, that boat or that tide has lifted all boats, but the difference between the rich and the poor, the Chileans have had a tough time in reducing that. Generally, a country with a wealth level of Chile would have, we would find in countries like Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, Poland, they have much less of a divide between rich and poor. And so what you have is a middle class in Chile who has worked very hard, paid its taxes, done the right thing, paid for their own university education because public university only gets so far, pay for their own medicine because the public health system is relatively weak, pay for their own highways to travel around the country because most roads are toll roads. And yet they're not necessarily seeing benefits from that. So they're paying taxes, but they're also paying for all these toll roads, which is a very different model than the rest of Latin America that generally relies on natural resources and then subsidizes. Fuel subsidies in Ecuador, in Mexico, in Venezuela tend to help out the poor. Electricity subsidies in Argentina were a big, very popular policy under Kirchner. Chile has never embraced that. Now, to their credit, that has helped their growth, but has not helped distribution of income. And so when you have a president who is a billionaire and a party that basically came to power because the left showed signs of corruption, and also the left governed in a very difficult economic period, mistook their rise in popularity as somehow the country wanted to go back to those neoliberal policies. But that's not where Chile is. If you think of the world in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Chileans don't need to worry about food on their table or even basic security. They've moved on from that. They aspire for more than most Latin American voters. They want equality. They want access to university education. They want environmental protections. These are things that are aspirational in other parts of Latin America, but are very much front and center for middle-class thinking in Chile. And the government has to respond to that, and they've been slow to do that. And that's why the small protest became such a big one, or that's one of the reasons why. So let's move on from there. In Peru, you still have a sort of Game of Thrones politics going on in Lima. Congressional politics has become so dirty in Peru in the last several years that public support for Congress is somewhere around 10 to 12%. So when Vizcarra basically dismissed Congress, closed Congress, shut it down, it was actually a popular move because he's seen as a guy who's fighting corruption. Now that's dangerous because presidential politics without the balance of congressional politics or strong institutions can lead to other forms of misappropriation of power and corruption. But for now, for Peruvian sake, from a Peruvian perspective, they would prefer that Vizcarra govern the country by himself without Congress. But for a lot of investors, that's troublesome. And so you're seeing a lot of people showing concern about investing in Peru. But the reality is that Peru made some very important reforms years ago that continue to bear fruit, both on its pension system that led to national savings, such that Peru doesn't rely on foreign capital as much as other countries, as well as the fact that they simplified their tax codes, something that Colombia and Brazil and other countries still need to do, so that small business thrives much more so in Peru than it does, say, in Colombia. As a result of that, we still have a lot of miners choosing to invest in Peru, a lot of energy companies choosing to invest in Peru. And that natural resource investment is still bringing money into Peru, along with Peru's strong ties to Asia, all of which helps keep the country growing in spite of the political turmoil. So a couple of thoughts. First of all, putting on my research nerd hat for a second, there is a built-in bias when you ask foreign investors what they think of Latin America. Why? Because foreign investors tend to participate, and they have the choice of investing in Latin America versus anywhere else in the world. And so those that do invest in Latin America are going to be putting their money into areas of growth and opportunity. Whereas the economy in general includes lots of sectors that are in maturation, that are no longer competitive, that are stifled by regulations and taxations, et cetera. So foreign direct investors are never a representative sample of how a country's doing. They are already cherry picking from the outset the best sectors because they have choice. Secondly, a lot of these companies are American companies, and right now things are going quite well, generally speaking, for US companies, and have been doing so for several years now, going back over a decade. And so when you're in that sort of level of optimism, you're surrounded by bosses are optimistic, then that optimism often transcends any of the sort of negative news you're hearing from one country to the other. Another important factor, I think, is that we tend to run our businesses looking through the rearview mirror. So if we had a good year last year, then that means as we're going into the budgeting season of, say, October, November, we generally are bringing that optimism to our forecast. And in spite of the risks that people see, they're very loath to suddenly put the brakes on that optimism and lower their expectations dramatically. There's already a sort of built-in momentum at the corporate level to that, Latin America has to deliver this kind of growth next year because they delivered it last year. So whenever we reach the end of a cycle, whether it's positively or negatively, there tends to be that overlap of the historics into our forecast. So that's, if you put together all those dynamics, that might begin to explain some of the differences between those outlooks. Look, the retail footprint in Latin America is still, the traditional retail footprint in Latin America is still pretty minor. As a whole, just to throw some statistics out there, for every Latin American, there is approximately 1 square foot of retail space. Versus the United States, for every American, there's about 22 square feet of retail space. The numbers in Latin America are similar to other emerging markets. China is also about 1 square foot per person. So there's plenty of room for traditional retail growth, particularly in second and third tier cities. So in the 10 largest cities in Latin America, you'll find just about any product that you want to source. But when you get into those smaller cities, luxury products, unusual products are much tougher to find in traditional retail, which is one of the impetuses for e-commerce growth. But there's still plenty of room of growth in secondary cities. In Brazil alone, there are 49 cities with at least 500,000 people. So there's lots of room for traditional retail growth, particularly in second and third tier markets. And then e-commerce in general, we're seeing the development more and more of e-commerce as the hurdles of payments and logistics, particularly last mile, are gradually overcome. Cross-border logistics, which has an amazing potential future, is still held back by issues at customs. There's lots
if I can jump in on that
please.
question, we've been looking a lot at innovation, right? And how retailers are thinking about innovation and bringing more innovative experiences to their stores in order to compete with digital experiences. So on the innovation front, aside from payments and incorporating more innovative payment experience, retailers are looking to evolve and offer more of an experience to customers when they walk into their stores. So incorporating food and beverage service, being really creative about offering different activities within stores, whether, an office supply store, thinking about opening a cafe, or even offering co-working opportunities. Introducing augmented and virtual reality experiences in stores. So retailers are starting to think we're more than a place that sells products. We're a place that offers an experience. We're a place that has a relationship with the consumer, just like digital platforms are doing. So kind of emulating that sort of diversification, retailers are starting to think about how we can do the same thing.
Tourism has two faces, right? So there's outbound tourism and there's inbound tourism. On the outbound side, there's a very strong correlation between Latin American currencies and the flow of outbound tourists. So when the Brazilian real was strong, you would hear Brazilian Portuguese spoken in certain parts of New York, particularly where you buy electronics and things like that. As the real collapsed in value, then you didn't see Brazilian tourists in New York. So Latin American tourists are curious and want to explore the world, but only those who can afford to will do so. And so it's not a lack of promotion and it's not a lack of interest, it's just economic capability. So when the currencies are weak, outbound tourism tends to weaken. On the inbound side, it's really a function of two things. Number one is safety and security and perceived safety and security. Latin America does not lack interesting places to visit, but if there is a overarching concern around safety and security, as there is in some of the jurisdictions, then that hurts tourism. Tourism should be much stronger in Colombia and Brazil than it is, and safety and security is an issue. That, and then there's domestic tourism. So people staying at home versus going abroad. And there you see interesting areas of development. First of all, there's the Airbnb factor, right? So there's the fact that Airbnb brings down domestic leisure travel options for Latin Americans tremendously. And so that makes it more interesting for them to travel at home, stretches their dollar spend out, et cetera. And then you have the development of more and more tourism facilities, tourism projects that are designed not just for international tourism, but also for domestic tourism. The northeast of Brazil has developed lots of different tourism offerings over the last 10, 15 years, ostensibly to attract international tourists, but now increasingly attract Brazilians. So a lot of Paulistas that I know who never used to travel to northern Brazil, they would prefer to go to beaches in other parts of the world, are now staying at home. And that's because the level of what's offered in northeastern Brazil is much higher than it was in the past. So those are some of the trends that we've seen anecdotally and the research that we've read. We are not an HR consulting firm, but based upon conversations that we've had with some of the leaders in that field, there's no question there's continues to be in many markets a relatively narrow band of critically thinking, well-educated, multilingual managers. And so when you get into a growth spurt, as Brazil was, say, in 2010, that band gets used up and the cost of managers goes up. In today's atmosphere in Latin America, I would say that's less so the crisis around HR. Where you see more of a issue around HR relates to what I was just talking about, digitization. People who are well-versed both technically, but also understanding the cross-section between the need to modernize on a technological point and its impact on how to run their businesses. So even senior managers, their ability to understand and absorb all of these technical trends and how they're going to impact their business strategically. That sort of thinking, I think, is difficult to find for businesses in Latin America, as well as the hard skills around technology and modernization. So those are some of the things that we've heard anecdotally that seem to make sense to us. A comment from somebody who said Latin American demographics will be negative 15 to 25 years from now, but the right now it's still a positive for consumption. Absolutely true. Consumption to the degree it's driven by demographics in Latin America is a positive thing. If you have 2 kids to take care of instead of 4, that means you have more disposable income to spend on things like computers and technology and cars and housing, et cetera, which are the big ticket items that drive consumption. But where we see the demographic shift problematic is the expansion of the so the labor force is not growing as fast as it was because there are fewer kids entering the labor force and there are more and more people retiring out of the labor force. So it is on the labor force side, it is already becoming a problem. On the consumption side, yes, it's still going to be positive for the next decade to 20 years. The IDC came out with some interesting stats around technology spend and also corporate thinking around issues such as preparing their companies for artificial intelligence and other digitization. And it was, I think, a surprise to most people who read the report just how far ahead the thinking is of multilatinas in Latin America, the well-capitalized cross-border operating companies in Latin America. They are already very much embracing digitization. Whether they are marshaling enough money and how well they are coordinating their different divisions to tackle digitization will vary case by case. But there's no question that there's a high level of consciousness of this issue. We have seen predictive numbers of IT spend growing at somewhere between 6 to 8% per year pretty constantly over the next decade in Latin America. Much of it is driven by the need to modernize. Mexico is a great example. In Mexico, you have large companies that have really spent a lot of money in modernizing their companies, becoming more competitive on the global field in manufacturing as well as the service sector, whereas smaller companies who don't have access to capital have failed to modernize, which further divides the corporate sector that's big and modern from the small business sector in places like Mexico. And a similar trend is found around the region. Your larger companies are very much trying to keep up with digitization trends, where smaller companies are struggling in that field. Okay, so we're really talking about the Odebrecht scandal in Brazil that through Odebrecht touched another 7 or 8 countries. Those cases are still making political noise in countries like Colombia, in countries like the DR, in Panama, in Peru. So the repercussions politically are still there. The litigation side effects are being dealt with in Brazil, in New York, and eventually may also impact those other countries, probably less so on the litigation side than the political side. Is corruption rising or falling? That's always a difficult thing to comment on. We do know that when governments have more money, there's more corruption, and when they have less money, there's less corruption. Right now, they're in a situation, they're in a pattern of their business cycle where they have less money. We also know that in Brazil, you have a judiciary that is much stronger and more independent than most countries in Latin America. And as a result, the political class has become much more careful about corruption issues. You also have a president who was brought to power, much of it based upon his promise of anti-corruption. So I think it's safe to say that Brazil, what's going on today in the government, is a lot less corrupt than it was just 5 or 6 years ago. But it's difficult to say country by country. People worry about corruption in Mexico, but will AMLO be more or less corrupt than Peña Nieto? That's tough to say. Peña Nieto there's certainly lots of anecdotal evidence to show that his was a very corrupt administration. Certainly AMLO also came to power promising to cut down on corruption. But what we're seeing in terms of the money and support going into whistleblowing and the sort of basic infrastructure to combat corruption, that is not happening. So I would say that it really varies country by country. And generally speaking, until you have strong judiciary, until you have strong whistleblowing mechanisms, and until you empower people with the political certainty that whistleblowing will not get them in trouble and will have a positive impact. Without those things, without civil contribution, without judicial contribution, without institutions, it's tough to combat corruption in any part of the world. Commodity dependence is often criticized as a weakness for Latin America, but I don't see it that way. There's lots of commodity-rich countries around the world that do very well: Norway, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The commodity, having lots of commodity resources, having a lot of natural resources, and the ability to exploit them, is a great thing as long as it's coupled with good governance, rule of law, and economic discipline. Countries with a lot of abundant wealth, whether it's the Mideast with oil, Norway, the province of Alberta, Chilean copper, what these countries and jurisdictions have done well is they've put together a rainy day fund such that when commodity prices are above historical average, they put money into the fund, and then they draw from that fund in times of crises. If you can combine resource wealth with that kind of economic discipline and governance, then it's a great thing. You can invest in things like education and technology, which is what Australia and Canada have done very well, and grow those types or sides of their economies. So I don't see a commodity curse as a curse as long as it's well managed, but that's not an easy thing to do politically. Latin America continues to have a couple of great things going for it. First of all, there's only really two main operating languages in Latin America. So the ability to take business ideas and push them across borders and build scale in doing so is still very viable in Latin America. Another is the population. So yes, Latin America is an aging population, but still for the next 15 to 20 years, it will remain a great consumer market. And that, combined with the fact that Latin America is historically an open market compared to Asian markets, means that for exporters, it will continue to be a very interesting market to which they can export their goods and services. So there's a lot of reasons to like Latin America. Now, one of the things that I pointed out at the very beginning as a weakness to Latin America was the lack of productivity growth. And this is partly because it really comes down to, and myself and a gentleman named Jerry Har wrote a book called Can Latin America Compete back in 2007. And really, although there's 14 chapters looking at all different areas, the common denominator of Latin America's weakness was the lack of rule of law. And the lack of rule of law led to the lack of development of intellectual property, because good ideas were developed by people who did not have faith in the legal systems of their own countries to defend those ideas. And so they took those ideas and they would go to Silicon Valley or somewhere else to develop them. That's beginning to change with cloud computing and with smartphone delivered apps, such that there is a revolution in fintech. There is a revolution in disruptive technologies. And as Ricardo pointed out, those technologies in the first wave were imported. Now they're being developed locally using ideas from abroad, but tropicalizando those ideas, making those ideas adaptable to Latin American reality. And we're also starting to see the beginnings of disruptive technologies that are being developed inside Latin America, original, that have global exportability. But this whole new disruptive channel, this ability to bring in disruptive business ideas into Latin America, is going to raise productivity of the services sector, 70% of Latin America's economy, that was untouched by globalization and by free trade. And that is a promising underpinning of what we believe will be an increase in productivity in Latin America in the next 20 years, which will raise real wages and create wealth in Latin America.